Hi, everyone. My name is Mark Thomas, and I'm the director of the Global Labor Research Center. And on behalf of the center, I'd really like to welcome you to the inaugural John Eleen Annual Lecture in Global Labor, organized by our center. The Global Labor Research Center is engaged in the study of work, employment, and labor in the context of a changing global economy. We host research projects and visiting researchers. We organize a regular speaker series, and we host an annual graduate student conference, which is ongoing today and tomorrow. We also do a lot of work with unions and community organizations to both better understand the changing world of work and to support organizing and policy interventions to prompt progressive social change. This event, the John Eleen Annual Lecture in Global Labor, it's a new initiative for the center. And as I mentioned, this is the first one. John Eleen was the research director of the Ontario Federation of Labour for over 20 years. And with the support of his wife, Ann Thompson, who's here with us tonight, we've established this annual lecture in his name. And the lecture aims to explore pressing social and economic problems of our times. And as you can gather from the title of our talk tonight, Higher Education and the Plague of Authoritarianism, the lecture that we're hearing this evening will certainly fit that description. Now, before we begin tonight's lecture, which will be delivered by Professor Henry Giroux from McMaster University, I want to acknowledge and thank the Ontario Federation of Labour and also Unifor for co-sponsoring the event. And also, as I mentioned, there's an ongoing graduate student conference today and tomorrow, and this lecture is part of that conference as well. And so I wanted to also acknowledge the supporters of that conference, which includes a number of York University bodies, the Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies, the Faculty of Graduate Studies, the Vice President Research and Innovation, the Vice President Academic and Provost, the Canada Research Chair in the Political Economy of Gender and Work, the Center for Feminist Research, Osgoode Hall Law School, graduate programs in Geography and in Public Policy and Administration, the Spaces of Labor and Moments of Urban Populism Research Project, and also outside of York, the Canadian Association for Work and Labor Studies, and the Launa Enrico Henry Mancinelli Professor in Global Labor Issues from McMaster University. Now, I'd also like to very quickly take the opportunity to note that as part of our conference tomorrow afternoon, along with the York's Center for Feminist Research, we are co-hosting a performance of a fabulous play called Life on the Line, Women's Strike at Eaton's, 1984-1985. It's a play that captures the experience of the 1980s Eaton strike. The play is being held at 2 o'clock in Vanier College at the Fred Thury Studio Theatre. The performance is free, seating is limited. So we do have an RSVP site set up that you can access via our webpage, yorku.ca/glrc. Okay, to get things going, I'm going to turn to Peter Avery, Associate Dean of Students here in the Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies, and he will make some welcoming remarks on behalf of the faculty. And then also Candice Kochpa, who is a member of the GLRC Graduate Student Symposium Organizing Committee, and she will introduce our speaker, Henry Giroux. Thanks very much.
Don't worry, I don't have too much to say. I welcome everybody on behalf of the Dean. The Dean unfortunately couldn't make it, and she's much more eloquent than I am, so you miss it on that. But when I saw that I was going to this, I did look at who was speaking, and I saw Henry Giroux. I said, oh, I haven't heard of that guy. In fact, I remember about 20 years ago, I think you gave a talk here at Osgoode Hall that I attended. And I even remember it was about crossing boundaries or crossing borders. It was conceptual, physical, things, metaphorical. So it was very inspirational. So and think about that. I don't work in that area. I'm a linguist. I attended that lecture. I actually remember kind of the content. So I'm sure you're in for a great talk, and really happy that I was able to come to welcome you, and on behalf of the Dean at least. And so have a good time.
On behalf of the organizing committee of the Global Labor Research Center, it is my privilege to say a few words about our guest of honor, Dr. Henry Giroux. A prolific scholar, teacher, and social critic, Dr. Giroux has impressively published over 60 books and 400 articles. A few of his recent book titles include Neoliberalism's War on Higher Education, The Violence of Organized Forgetting, America at War with Itself, and The Public in Peril, Trump and the Menace of Authoritarianism. Elsewhere, he is a regular contributor to online journals including Truth Out and Counterpunch, and appears on news programs such as Democracy Now! And RT. Perhaps most impressive about this catalog of work, however, is the sheer scope of social institutions and issues that he tirelessly takes on. His work spans cultural studies, youth studies, critical pedagogy, popular culture, media studies, social theory, and the politics of higher and public education. And he does all of this in an accessible way that connects politics to our everyday lives. To this end, in 2002, Routledge named him one of the top 50 educational thinkers of the modern period. He now holds the McMaster University Chair for Scholarship in the Public Interest in the Department of English and Cultural Studies, in addition to serving on the editorial and advisory boards of numerous scholarly journals, as well as editing 4 scholarly book series. Please join me in welcoming our keynote speaker for the inaugural John Eleen Annual Lecture in Global Labor, Dr. Henry Giroux.
Thank you so much. It's really an honor to be here. I'm particularly honored, this thing can stay straight, to be able to participate in the celebration of the inaugural John Eleen Lecture in Global Labor. I'm particularly impressed that his wife is here. And I feel honored to be able to basically address, in some ways, the spirit and the legacy of John. You know, I came to Canada in 2004 at a time when George Bush had just been reelected. And I thought to myself, wow, thank God I'm getting away from that. Who would ever have known that I could have been so prescient given the situation that we now find? I mean, some of us have, people in the United States now find themselves. This talk is dedicated to Donald Trump. I'm only kidding. Donald Trump's ascendancy in American politics has made visible a scourge of oppressive stupidity, manufactured deceptions, a corrupt political system, and a contempt for reason that has been decades in the making. It also points to the withering of civic attachments, the undoing of civic culture, the decline of public life, and the erosion of any sense of shared citizenship. Galvanizing his base of true believers in post-election demonstrations, the world is witnessing how Trump's history of unabashed racism and politics of hate is transformed into a spectacle of fear, divisions, and disinformation. Under President Trump, the plague of mid-20th century authoritarianism has returned, not only in the menacing spectacle of populist rallies, fear-mongering, unchecked bigotry and humiliation, but also in an emboldened culture of war, militarization, and extreme violence that looms over society like a rising storm. Thank you. The reality of Trump's election may be the most momentous development of the age because of its apocalyptic irrationality and the shock that it has produced. The whole world is watching, pondering how such a dreadful event could have happened. How have we arrived here? What forces have undermined education as a democratic public sphere, making it incapable of producing the formative culture and critical citizens that could have prevented such a catastrophe from happening in a so-called alleged democracy? We get a glimpse of the failure of this civic culture, education, and civic literacy in the willingness and the success of the Trump administration to empty language of any meaning, a practice that constitutes a kind of flight from historical memory, from ethics, from justice, and social responsibility. Under such circumstances, and with too little opposition, the United States government has taken on the workings of a disimagination machine, characterized by an utter disregard for the truth, and often accompanied, as in Trump's case, by primitive schoolyard taunts and threats. In this instance, Orwell's, quote, "ignorance is strength," materializes in the Trump administration's weaponized attempt not only to rewrite history, but basically to obliterate it. What we are witnessing is not simply a political project, but a reworking of the very meaning of education, both as an institution and as a broader cultural force. Truth is now viewed as a liability and ignorance a virtue. Under the reign of this normalized architecture of alleged common sense, education is now regarded with disdain. Words are reduced to data, and science is confused with pseudoscience. All traces of critical thought appear only at the margins of the culture as ignorance becomes the primary organizing principle of American society. For instance, 2/3 of the American public believe that creationism should be taught in the schools, and a majority of Republicans in Congress do not believe that climate change is caused by human activity, making the U.S. the laughing stock of the world. Trump revels in his role as a serial liar, knowing that the public is easily seduced by exhortation, emotional outburst, and sensationalism, all of which mimics the infantilization of celebrity culture and reality TV. Image selling now entails lying on principle, making it easier for politics to dissolve into entertainment, pathology, and a kind of unique brand of criminality. The corruption of both the truth and politics is abetted by the fact that the American public has become habituated to overstimulation and lives in an ever-increasing overflow of information and images. Experience no longer has the time to mature into informed thought. Popular culture revels in the spectacle of shock and violence. Defunded and stripped of their role as a public good, many institutions of higher education are now harnessed to the demands of the warfare state and the needs of the corporation and financial elite. And in doing so, they have succumbed to the neoliberal assault on higher education with its increasing power of management and the undermining of faculty self-governance. Higher education in our politically desperate age is threatened by a legacy that it does not dare to name. And that inheritance has an eerie resonance with an authoritarian past that inserts itself in part with a growing belief among the American public that education is bad for America, and that it's at odds with Trump's vision of making America great again, which of course is code for making America white again. The Trump administration needs education to fail in a particular way. Hostile to its role as a public good and democratic public sphere, it's attempting to reshape education according to the market-driven logic of neoliberalism, with its emphasis on privatization, commodification, deregulation, fear, and managerialism. In this reactionary view, education is defined in economic terms and is beholden to the assumption that only corporations and market-driven interests have the right to define both the purpose of education and what type of education is needed by students. Under such circumstances, higher education is threatened for its potential as a public sphere, capable of educating students as informed, critical thinkers, capable of not only holding power accountable, but also fulfilling the role of critical agents who can act against injustice and resist diverse forms of oppression. Byung-Chul Han has argued that every age has its signature affliction, and in this case, the current historical moment is notable for its embrace of a culture of unfocused fear, its war on labor, its attack on the welfare state, its devaluation of public goods, and its ongoing assault on youth in higher education. Some of you may know, for instance, that this Congress just passed a budget in which it gave $1 trillion in tax cuts to the rich, while at the same time eliminating programs that basically benefit students who need food stamps or who get food in school programs for free. I mean, it's beyond cruel. It's, I've often talked about it as part of a culture of cruelty. Those words really don't sum up enough the horror and the shame that embodies these policies. The corrupt machinery of power has now reached the highest global levels in the U.S. government, and in doing so, it is changing both the language of educational reform while making it difficult for faculty and students to resist their own erasure from modes of self-governance and critical education. New forms of racist discrimination, unbridled commodification, and exclusion, rooted in a retreat from ethics to social imagination and democracy itself weakens the role higher education might take in an age of increasing tyranny. Against the force of a highly militarized mode of casino capitalism, in which violence and a resurgent white supremacy are at the center of power, higher education is being weakened in its ability to resist the authoritarian machinery of social death now shaping American society. The modern loss of faith in the merging of education and democracy needs to be reclaimed. But that will only happen if the long legacy of struggle over education is once again brought to life as part of a more comprehensive understanding of education being central to politics itself. Many of the great activists of the 20th century, extending from W.E.B. Du Bois and Paulo Freire to Jane Addams and Martin Luther King Jr., shared a passion for education, not as a methodology, but as a democratic project. They emphasized producing individuals who believed in education both as a public good and as a practice of freedom. For them, education was a moral and political force whose goal was to inspire and energize people to assume a degree of civic courage, social responsibility, and informed agency. Refusing to view education as neutral or reducing it to the instrumental and mercenary practice of training, they sought to reclaim education as part of a wider struggle to deepen and extend the values, the social relations, and the institutions of a radical democracy. They argued passionately that education could not be removed from the demands of justice and progressive social change. They understood that tyranny and authoritarianism are not just the product of state violence and repression, but also thrive on popular docility, mass apathy, and a flight for moral responsibility. Each wrote during times of momentous political revolutions when democracy was under siege. In doing so, they recognized the value of and made a real moment of truth about education and its ability to transform how people understood themselves, their relations to others, and of course the larger world. And in the face of massive injustice and indignity, these prophetic voices refused to look away from human suffering and embrace the possibility for resistance fueled by courage, compassion, and the ability to think otherwise in order to act otherwise. One of Martin Luther King's great insights was his recognition that education provided a bulwark against ignorance and indifference in the face of injustice. He warned people over and over again not to remain silent in the face of racism, militarism, and materialism. He argued that, quote, "He who accepts evil without protesting it is really cooperating with it." Of the civil rights era, King warned, "History will have to record that the greatest tragedy of this period of social transition was not the strident clamor of the bad people, but the appalling silence of the good people. In the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends." Advocates of civic courage and compassion reflected in their words and actions what King called the fierce urgency of now, reminding us that tomorrow is today and there is such a thing as being too late. Let us hope that in the midst of our witnessing the current revolt against democracy across the globe, that higher education will remain neither silent nor be too late. Echoing King's belief that American innocence was neither tenable nor forgivable, the great novelist James Baldwin filled in the missing language of fear and terrorism at the heart of a racist society. His fame, Talk to Teachers, began with an impassioned warning about the times in which he lived, a warning that might be more relevant now than it was delivered in the speech that he gave in 1963, in which he said, "Let's begin by saying that we are living in a very dangerous time. Everyone in this room, in one way or another, is aware of that. We're in a revolutionary situation, no matter how unpopular that word has become in this country. The society in which we live is desperately menaced from within. To any citizen of this country who figures himself as responsible, and particularly those of you who deal with the minds and hearts of young people, must be prepared to go for broke. In the context of a worldwide rebellion taking place against democracy, dissent, labor unions, human rights, and justice, I think it's time we need to go for broke. Authoritarianism is on the rise once again, emerging in countries in which our politics, in light of the past, has appeared unthinkable and unspeakable. In Hungary, India, Turkey, and Poland, among other countries, democracy is being voted down and aggressively dismantled. In addition, a new and dangerous moment has emerged in the United States as it becomes clear that an American-style authoritarianism is no longer the stuff of fantasy, fiction, or hysterical paranoia. I remember in the 60s, we used to say, well, the CIA is probably watching us with cameras and blah, 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 and this is all going to happen. And everybody would say we were just paranoid. And all of a sudden, that paranoia now is as real as it's ever been. This summer in Charlottesville, Virginia, hundreds of neo-Nazis marched, brandishing torches, reminiscent of Hitler's Germany, while shouting anti-Semitic, racist, and white nationalist slogans appropriately named Heil Trump. They also unleashed an orgy of violence that led to the deaths of 3 people. Donald Trump, the supposed president of the United States, stated that there were good people on both sides of that rally, as if good people march with white supremacists and neo-Nazis who revel in hate and offer no apologies for supporting a racist worldview and mimicking actions that resulted in the slaughter of millions during the fascist nightmares of the 1930s and 40s. What does the election of Donald Trump and the rise of illiberal democracies all over the world and the globe suggest about the role of higher education in a time of tyranny? What does the authoritarianism that is emerging in the United States suggest about the need for higher education to go for broke? When does silence betray complicity and inaction, moral and intellectual failing? What does it mean to rethink higher education as a crucial democratic public sphere in dangerous times? Clearly, such questions have to first address what is happening in Trump's America, a country often seen and imagines itself to be a beacon of freedom and democracy throughout the world. And the next question, where will Canada be after its next election? Donald Trump's ascendancy to the presidency speaks not only to a profound political crisis, but also a tragedy for democracy. His rise to power echoes not only a moral blind spot in the collective American psyche, but also a refusal to recognize how past totalitarian ideas, values, and practices can and have reappeared in different forms in the present. The crystallization of totalitarian elements such as anti-Semitism, resurgent nationalism, militarism, racism, white supremacy, and the return of the demagogue who couples the language of fear, decline, and demonization with the illusions of national grandiosity have found their apotheosis in the figure of Donald Trump. Trump is the living symbol and embodiment of a political catastrophe made visible in the plague of a growing culture of unbridled and naked selfishness. The systemic erosion of public goods, the collapse of civic institutions, and a ruinous anti-intellectualism that supports a contempt for evidence and reason that has been decades in the making. He exhibits no shame in accelerating a corrupt political system that has a toxic embrace of white supremacy. There is nothing natural or inevitable about these changes. They are learned behaviors. As shared fears replace any sense of shared responsibility, the American public is witnessing how a politics of racism and hate is transformed into a society plagued by fear, divisiveness, and disinformation. While numerous forces have led to the election of Donald Trump, it is crucial to ask how a poisonous form of education developed in the larger society, one that has contributed to a toxic culture that both legitimated Trump and encouraged many millions to follow him. Part of the answer, I would think, lies in the control of the media, the right-wing media with its vast propaganda machines, such as Fox News, renamed Pravda, the rise of conservative foundations such as the Koch brothers' various institutes, the ongoing production of anti-public intellectuals, and a visual culture increasingly dominated by the spectacles of violence and reality TV, all of which offer up the swindle of a public sphere that resembles, it seems to me, a disregard for the search for truth. On a more political note, it's crucial to ask, how is it that the educative force of the wider culture goes unchallenged in creating a public that embraced Trump's bigotry, narcissism, lies, public history of sexual groping, and racism, all the while transforming the citizens as a critical political agent into consumers of hate and anti-intellectualism. The institutions that work to free and strengthen the imagination and the capacity to think and act critically were under assault long before the rise of Donald Trump. Over the last 50 years, language as an ethical, political, and cultural tool has been denigrated as democratic institutions that make up civic culture have come under a massive assault by the corporate elite, who control and drive the commanding and political economic forces of neoliberalism. Critical public spheres, from public radio to the public schools, have been defunded, commercialized, and privatized, transforming them from the spheres of critical analysis to dumbed-down workstations for a deregulated and commodified culture. News morphs into entertainment as thoughtlessness increases ratings. Violence feeds the spectacle of sensationalism, and serious journalism is now replaced by empty cosmetic stenographers. Language is pillaged as meaningful ideas, knowledge, and narratives are replaced by information broken into bytes and bits, along with a growing emphasis on immediacy and real-time responses. In the face of this dumbing down of meaning, culture, historical memory, and ethics, critical thinking and the institutions that promote a thoughtful and informed polity disappear into the vast abyss of what I called previously a disimagination machine. Nuance is transformed into state-sanctioned vulgarity. How else to explain the popularity and credibility of terms such as post-truth, fake news, and alternative facts? I mean, Orwell must be, rolling over in his grave. This is better than Orwell. I mean, Orwell couldn't have imagined this stuff, right? Marsha Green is right in arguing that in the Trump era, language that is used to lie and validate incomprehensible drivel not only destroys any vestige of civic literacy, it threatens the survival of democratic public spheres. We live in a moment of digital time, a time of relentless immediacy, when experience no longer has the chance to crystallize into informed thought. Communication is now reduced to a form of public relations and a public rhetoric that is overheated and over-exaggerated and always over the top. The mainstream media caters to the spectacle and echoes of demagoguery rather than question it. Thinking is disdained and is viewed as dangerous. I mean, Trump's comment about how he loves the uneducated, or his comment that he could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and people would still vote for him, sort of, you know, among other things, testify to all of this. What kind of democracy is possible when institutions crucial to a vibrant civil society in the nation all of a sudden begin to vanish? Lacking public funds, many institutions of higher education have been left to mimic the private sector, transforming knowledge into a commodity while also eliminating those courses and departments that don't align themselves with a robust bottom line. In addition, faculty are increasingly treated like Walmart workers, with labor relations increasingly designed, as my friend Noam Chomsky says, to reduce labor costs and to increase labor civility. Under such circumstances, power is concentrated in the hands of a growing managerial class that too often views education simply through the lens of a market-driven culture that harnesses both matters of governance and teaching and learning to the instrumental needs of the economy. Consequently, democratic and creative visions and the ethical imagination collapse into calls for efficiency, increasing the bottom line, and a deadening conformity at odds with any viable notion of leadership. What's so shocking about this is that when you look across the ideological spectrum, particularly in the mainstream political parties, it's almost impossible to find a policy that's progressive around education. Whether we're talking about Obama, or whether we're talking about Bush, education is about training. It's not about creating critical citizens. It's not about what it means for education to breathe life into democracy. It's not about, in some way, defending those public spheres that can't be tied simply to the logic of instrumentality. It's about testing. It's about the culture of positivism. It's about the assumption that people can be workers and don't have to think. They can be workers and they don't have to bear any social responsibility for the world in which they find themselves, that they should learn how to be governed rather than to govern. That's not education. That's training. And that's not an argument against certain forms of education which are training. It's an argument against a notion of education that collapses into training. That's different. Under this market-driven governance, faculty lose their power and autonomy, while students are often relegated to the status of customers and clients, saddled with high tuition rates and a future predicated on ongoing political uncertainty, economic instability, and ecological peril. Education now runs the risk of functioning to make students masses or consumers rather than critically engaged citizens. I can't walk through the student union at McMaster University and almost any university I visit without realizing it's now a mall. Clothes are being sold. People are recruiting. There's no understanding of how that space, which is not tied to the classroom, could somehow be reproducing a logic at odds with what a classroom should be doing. This dystopian view feeds on an obsession with the narrow notion of job readiness and a cost accounting notion of instrumental rationality, and bespeaks to the rise of what theorists such as Stuart Hall called an audit or corporate culture, which serves to demoralize and depoliticize both faculty and students, often relieving them of any larger values other than those that reinforce their own self-interest and a retreat from any sense of social and moral responsibility. More specifically, as higher education both denies and actively abandons its role as a democratic public sphere, it tends to provide an education in which the citizen once again is transformed into a consumer, laying the foundation for the development of self-seeking agents who inhabit crippling orbits of privatization while indifferent to the growth of despotic power around them. At the same time, too many faculty join what the late Zygmunt Bauman, has called the corporate professors, which he describes, quote, as professors who have bought into or been shaped by the corporate culture of the university and seem strangely inarticulate about the purposes and worth of higher education. I'm often startled by this because sometimes what I find is I find myself talking to faculty who, A, don't believe that there's a relationship between what they teach and the larger social world, but B, seem to be under the illusion that the current attack on education has nothing to do with them. That somehow they fail to realize that the conditions of their own labor are at risk. That if they can't defend what they do to a public that's trying to figure out why education matters, all of a sudden they find themselves in the role of actually being complicit with the very forces that are attacking education. I mean, this is not an argument against theory. This is not an argument against the relevance of education in ways that suggest that it open itself up and address important social issues. This is a call to say, hey, look, you know, as a public institution, we have to defend ourselves. It's crucial that we learn how to defend what we do in a way that's not defensive, but educates a larger public and says, hey, look, you can't exist. Democracy is not going to exist without us. The economic, the GDP, you know, the growth, the economic growth, whatever you want to talk about, basically in some way benefits from what the university does by engaging students and faculty in ways that make them citizens of the world, that make them agents who can look at a problem and imagine it in terms not limited to their disciplines, that can use a language that is rigorous and at the same time accessible. I must be getting old. I was born right after Lincoln died. And I find myself now opening books, reading 7 pages and thinking, I can't do this. Stuff is Greek. You know, this is not to say that language should be on the frontier of pushing knowledge to another place. But I don't believe that language itself has to be so stymied that it transforms itself into a jargon that only 5 people can understand. It can always be translated. It can always be translated. And it seems to me that's an act of pedagogical intervention that is crucial to what education means. Because if we can't translate private issues into larger systemic considerations, we've lost the ability to be political agents. We've lost the ability to understand the world outside of the deadening logic of privatization. We've lost the ability to be citizens of the world. We become atoms, socially, as Leo Lowenstein used to say, socially atomized, which may be the great plague of the 21st century. It may not be exploitation anymore. It may be the logic of disposability and atomization, the inability to connect, the inability to understand the language of community, the inability to understand the language of democracy, the inability to move beyond a kind of individualism that cripples in its assumptions that all problems are individual problems, preventing people from understanding that if they're going to fight against issues and against problems that are not of their own making, they can't do it alone. This is all mimicked in the university, right? I mean, you walk around the corridors of the university and you see somebody who's been there for 3 years, and one day you meet them in the bathroom and say, "Oh, you down the hall?" You know, I mean, this inability to talk to each other. I mean, the inability to be collaborative, and it starts early, right? I mean, look, you know, I was a working class kid, grew up in Providence, Rhode Island, and one of the great first lessons I learned was with my friend Emilio Natlizia in the 2nd grade. I went to a Catholic school. They all looked like penguins then. And I remember we were going to take a test. We're taking a test, and I pulled Emilio over, and I said, "Let's do it together." And all of a sudden, this nun came flying down the hall, hit me in the back of the head, I think, with an eraser, and said, No. You take tests and you learn alone." Yeah, there it goes. That's when it begins. And as my friend Howard Zinn used to say, and when we went to history class, where was the history of labor unions? Where was the histories of women? Where were the histories of minority? Did Napoleon really cross into Russia alone? I mean, all of a sudden, the whole notion of the social begins to disappear. And one has to understand that in some way, this new technology, coupled within a discourse of commodification and privatization, reinforces that. It's not an argument against the technology per se. It's an argument against the value system that tells us how to use it. You know, it seems to me that we live in a world in which the truth hasn't simply been degraded, it's become obsolete. And one has to take seriously something that Václav Havel once said that impressed me immensely. He said, "Politics follows culture." Now, for those of you who are economic determinists, you don't like that, because you tend to believe that economic structures are the only structures that really matter. But I got to tell you, consciousness matters. Until people have a grasp of the conditions in which they find themselves, there are no political guarantees. They vote for Trump. They celebrate morons, like this guy Moore, who just got elected, who's going to be elected to the Senate. Is it Mississippi or Alabama? I forgot. Who says that gays should be hanged. I mean, you know, and when I say that politics follows culture, that makes a certain demand upon us as educators. And that demand is that we have to take seriously the notion that education is not just about schooling, that it's also about central to politics. Central to politics. As Pierre Bourdieu used to say, hey, look, the great tools of oppression don't just reside in economic structures, and the great tools of resistance don't just reside in exposing them. That the great tools of resistance lie in notions of persuasion, in notions of argument, in being able to make pedagogical interventions in which people can read and see a language in which they can recognize themselves. You know, my father worked in a chemical factory, very primitive, in the 1950s. He came home one day and he told me a story. He said some group called SBS had come to the factory and they were talking about Mao Zedong. And he said, who is this guy, Mao Zedong? He was a little confused. And he said, they're telling us about how they had put the alphabet on the back of people marching in the mountains. And people had learned how to become literate. He said, shit, so we got chemicals all over the plant here. People can't breathe. Why aren't they talking to me about the chemicals? Why aren't they talking to me about organizing the workers in a union? Why aren't they talking about the power of labor and what we can do to change our conditions? This is where abstraction becomes a violence, because it understands its subject, but it doesn't understand its object. It has no way of making something meaningful to make it critical, to make it transformative. And it seems to me in that lack of translation, something gets lost. Politics, the ability to move people, you know, the ability to in some way say, look, we share a certain desperation, but it's not just my desperation or your desperation. It's a desperation that has to be addressed collectively. I went off a bit, sorry. I want to end by talking about a few things that I think education can do. Some tidbits of concern that I have about what it means for educators, administrators, teachers, researchers to somehow take seriously what it means to exercise certain kinds of intellectual capacities, cultivate the ethical imagination, hold power accountable, and embrace a certain sense of social responsibility. And I want to do this by sort of trying to move away from just a language of critique to a language of hope, because I haven't been very hopeful thus far. But these are treacherous times, and I think that we have to be careful about romanticizing them in ways that suggest that all we have to do is either pray or hope for the better and things will change. Not going to happen that way. First, it seems to me that higher education needs to reassert its mission as a public good. It's lost its way under the reign of neoliberalism. It doesn't know how to define itself anymore in terms that suggest there is a long legacy of it being a democratic public sphere in which what mattered about education was the way in which it contributed to the ecology of democracy and how it took it seriously. You all know the history. You know what happened in the 1960s when education was seen as an enormously powerful democratizing force. And people mobilized, and against the war in Vietnam. They mobilized for the free speech movement. The civil rights movement was taking off. And the conservatives had an epileptic fit. They couldn't believe what was going on. They couldn't believe that education could be opened up to minorities. They couldn't believe that education could be something more than simply a mode of indoctrination into the established relations of power. Alan Bloom, writes a book talking about how blacks and working class people don't belong in the Ivy League schools because they're not smart enough. That those schools really only should be catering to the white, wealthy elite. Save me. But even more importantly, the Powell memo comes out. The Trilateral Commission writes a report. And what does it say? It says we have to do something to stop the excess of democracy. We have to close it down. We have to put a cover on these institutions. And they did something brilliant that the left failed to do. They created their own intellectuals. They took the realm of ideas seriously. They created, and they had the money, of course, right? They created foundations which they put on campuses as autonomous institutions. They created research centers. The Koch brothers alone, since 1980, have pumped $200 million into creating right-wing organizations on campuses all across North America, but especially in the United States. They understood that education was a terrain of struggle and not just simply an instrumental place where people learned how to work. Hayek knew it. They all knew it. And now you can't turn on television in the United States without seeing these quacking ducks, really spouting nonsense, justifying lies, talking heads. They're everywhere, shaping policy, they have the ear of the President of the United States. And it seems to me that the universities and the colleges may be one of the few places left where this can be counted, where we can take seriously what it means to educate people, to struggle for and deepen the promise of democracy. Secondly, it seems to me we need to acknowledge as fundamental to what we do and make good on the claim that a critically literate citizen is absolutely essential to democracy. You cannot have a democracy as Dewey, Arendt, Paulo Freire, name them all, King, they all said the same thing. Without an informed citizenry, you don't have a democracy. We're not just talking about critical thinking. We're not just talking about learning the great books. We're talking about the power of ideas to understand, in terms of understanding how they work, to produce certain kinds of desires, certain kinds of ideas, certain modes of agency. One could go so far as to argue that fundamentally what education is about is a struggle over identities, a struggle over how we want people to imagine the present and the future. A struggle over what it means to be alive with the passion and the lust for justice. To take seriously the notion that no society is ever just enough. Justice is always unfinished. The struggle is always ongoing. Democracy is never an end point. It's a starting point and a beginning. It's never an end. Thirdly, it seems to me that education needs to be viewed in its own right as free. Free. Why would we want to put people in higher and public education and then tie them to forms of menacing, crippling debt that takes them 20 years to get out of? That's part of the war on youth. That's not just about economic necessity. That's about the killing of the imagination. That's about redirecting students into jobs and employment opportunities where they have to take certain jobs to make money. It's a way to push them out of public service. I know, we sit back and we say, well, how could that possibly happen? Cut the military budget in half for the United States. That's how it will happen. They say now you can have a tuition free for every student in the United States for $65 billion. Bush wants to raise the military budget alone by $50 billion. Education is free, tuition is free in a number of countries. We know that. Free in Germany. It's free in a number of countries where they see education as a public good. They see it as vital, not just to the economy, but to the whole notion of the society in general as a democratic public sphere. Next, it seems to me that we live in a world driven by data, metrics, and the replacement of knowledge by an overabundance of information that in many ways isolates people and prevents larger comprehensive narratives from being understood. I'm troubled personally, to say the least, as somebody who's been around for many, many years, by this plunge into solo single issues. Which is not to say that these issues don't matter. They're enormously important because they expand the range of oppressions that people can recognize, fight for, and see themselves in. But we need a more comprehensive understanding of politics. We need a broader understanding of how these movements can coalesce and come together and create third parties, labor parties joining with social movements. We have to recognize that capitalism and democracy are not the same thing. We have to bring back the language of democratic socialism. We have to begin to talk about compassion and human needs as driving a society, rather than being pushed to the margins. It also seems to me that one of the things that we're all facing increasingly in these neoliberal institutions is the Walmart model of labor relations that, in my estimation, constitute a plague haunting higher education, especially in North America, especially with the strikes going on now, of course, in Toronto and Ontario. Because what we find and what we need to recognize, as Kathy Davidson points out, the situation of adjunct and contingent labor threatens the future of the university. And we must insist that full-time positions be replaced with full-time faculty. We might have to insist that people in some way have benefits that matter. In the United States, 70% of all faculty now are in part-time or short-term contracts in full-time positions, 70%. And as a matter of fact, the American Association of University Professors points out that many of these faculties make barely enough money to afford basic necessities, have little or no health insurance, and are reluctant to speak out for fear of losing their jobs. Many adjuncts are part of what are called the working class poor. Jordan Weissman, writing for Slate, points to an analysis by the University of California's Berkeley Center for Labor Research and Education, which states that 25% of part-time college faculty and their families now receive some sort of public assistance, such as Medicaid, the Children's Health Insurance Program, food stamps, cash welfare. It's an abomination, and it's shameful. And it's not just about the managerial elite who occupy and run these colleges. It's about a government that is unwilling to allocate enough money to these universities to allow part-time faculty to become full-time faculty, and it should be fought. They can buy F-25 jets at the cost of $400 million apiece, and we can't find ways to cut that military budget to be able to invest in the most treasured resource that we have, which is our youth. No, sorry. That has to be addressed, and it has to be addressed with great collective force. Finally, it seems to me that if critical analysis is going to break through the fog of ignorance and be asked to hold power accountable and reveal the workings of oppressive and unequal relations of power, a critique without hope is a prescription for cynicism, despair, and civic fatigue. A culture of questioning is crucial to any viable notion of teaching and learning, but it's not enough. Students need to stretch their imaginations to be able to think beyond common sense, the limits of their own experience. They need to believe that the present is not the future. They need to believe that hope has to be, is a function of being educated. That we're not talking about Disney-like hope. We're talking about educated hope. We're talking about hope that can imagine something different from the present. We're talking about a form of hope that is not Pollyannish or romanticized, but can imagine a future that has to be struggled for and therefore is grounded in the reality of the problems that it has to face. There was a recent article in the New Republic, again, about how hope is nothing more than a reflection of what Norman Vincent Peale wrote about in the 1950s, the power of positive thinking. I wanted to throw up. And I thought, this can't be, is this guy on drugs? Is that it? I mean, has the cynicism that emanates from the Trump administration become so overwhelming that you can get semi-intelligent journalists writing this stuff? sort of suggesting that there's no such thing as hope. What is there? If you don't have hope, where are you? Where do we end up? What does it mean? Do we say, just as Margaret Thatcher when she married Ronald Reagan and had a child who developed a book called There's No Alternative? That's it? There's nothing more? All right, let me finish. It seems to me that the political challenge of hope is to recognize that history's open, and that the ethical job of education, as Robert Hess has argued, is to refresh the idea of justice, which is going dead in us all the time. The late world-renowned and my dear friend, Zygmunt Bauman, insisted that the bleakness and dystopian politics of our times necessitates the ability to dream otherwise, to imagine a society which thinks it's never just enough. And it is precisely such a collective spirit informing a resurgent politics that is now being rewritten by many young people today in the discourse of critique and hope, emancipation and transformation. My first teacher, James Baldwin, captures the depth which both burdens hope and inspires it. In The Fire Next Time, he writes, "The impossible is the least that one can demand. Generations do not cease to be born. We are responsible to them. The moment we break faith with one another, the sea engulfs us and the lights go out. It's one of the tasks of educators in higher education to keep the lights burning with feverish intensity." Thank you.